Hello. Did you know that in the 2012 election, 42.5% of Americans didn't vote? This is coming from Statistic Brain, who also ranks the US as 120th out of 169 countries for which data exists on voter turnout. This is quite remarkable when you consider how important voting actually is to our society and our democracy. So to address this problem, we need to talk about why people don't vote. There's an NBC News article about this guy, Michael McDonald from George Mason University. He suggests that the problem is that we have too much democracy, or a lot of voting going on, which is true. There's voting opportunities for most Americans at least once a year, whether that be at their state, local, national, the list goes on and on. The frequency makes voting a hassle. Argentina and Australia are two countries that have combated this with mandatory voting, and they'll actually fine you if you skip out on the polls. Another hassle, according to McDonald, is voter registration, which is an idea that countries with the higher voter turnouts don't have. Another reason people skip the polls is the belief that their vote doesn't matter because it's just one vote, which isn't necessarily true. Consider this. When you take the amount of people who are registered to vote but don't, and then the amount of people who are eligible to vote but aren't registered, you get a gap of 20 million people to 95 million people who may be thinking that way. And that makes up a lot of people who together can make quite a difference with their votes. So for the rest of my speech, I'm going to be talking about why you should vote. I'm going to go over the fact that we vote for a lot, not just the president. I'm going to talk about the primaries and the caucuses and why they matter. And then I'm going to talk about our right to vote and what that means. So it's important to consider that we don't just vote for the president. When it's time to vote in November every 4 years and the presidential nominees have been named from both parties, a lot of people won't vote if they don't like either candidate. However, besides the president, these ballots are included with important state and local office holder positions that are really important for you to vote for. There's also things called referendums, which Google defines as a general vote by the electorate on a single political question that has been referred to them for a direct decision. So the government has asked the people, how do you feel about this issue? And they respond through secret ballot. This is pretty helpful. 4 states have used this method in the last 4 years, according to the Huffington Post, and used it to legalize recreational marijuana, specifically through that method of voting. There are also votes between the presidential elections every 4 years. There's congressional elections and then the elections of the Senate. These are important because of our checks and balance systems. The Congress and Senate can veto what the president is trying to pass. So it's important that you get the two working together, at least 2 of them working together. The way you do that is by voting for congressmen in your party as well as a president in your party. And that's how you see the changes that you want to be made. Next, let's talk about primaries and caucuses and why they matter. Many people don't vote in these, and these are elections that determine who will be the presidential nominees. One reason a large portion of people don't vote is because they're not registered as Republican or Democrat, which is the only 2 parties that vote in the primaries. Primaries are for narrowing down the 2 parties to usually have like 4 or 5 different candidates down to just 1 to compete for the presidency. According to Gallup, as of 2014, 42% of Americans are identifying as independents, which means 42% of Americans don't vote in the primaries. And you can see that in this graph that I have here. In the past 4 years especially, the amount of independent voters has skyrocketed. And it's also important to note that there's been a decline of Republican voters. So you can actually see where the voters are going. It doesn't make a lot of sense for people to be registering as independent voters, even if you like most of the third-party candidates, because history shows us what happens. No third-party candidate has ever won the presidency. On top of that 42% of people, there's also people that don't vote because they're just too lazy to pick from the large amount of candidates that are available in the primaries as opposed to the presidential elections, which usually just have a few. Many times, great candidates will lose out in the primaries for that reason. This usually happens when a younger demographic is supporting a candidate because the younger people just don't get out there and vote. I think that this has a tie-in with social media because a lot of people will think that simply sharing a post or supporting someone on the internet is the same as a vote, and it's not because it doesn't matter in our government. Aside from these national primary elections, all this stuff applies to your local elections too, because every election is important. Even if you don't care about the issue at hand, it's important for you to get out there and vote because that decision is going to impact your life one way or another. Lastly, let's talk about voting and our right to vote. The US is very fortunate that all the citizens have the right to vote. Only about 44% of the world's population has that right, according to the International Business Times in 2014. Although it's not our civic duty like jury duty, and we don't have to get out there and vote, you should think of voting the same as tipping your server at a restaurant. You don't have to do it, but you really should because it's the right thing to do. Voting is your voice. It's really the only way that us American people can show the government how we feel and show them what our opinions are. I mean, sure, there's petitioning and assembly, but voting is worth much more to the government than those two things. Voting is the way to express yourself in government. Voting is how we can bring about the change that we want to see in the world. I hope now you have a better understanding of voting and think of it as more important to you. Voting is a necessary part of the way that our country works. If you don't think you're making a difference, you're wrong, mainly because a lot of people feel that way. I mean, take those 42.5% of people and just imagine the possibilities